I came back from the ICU and saw my clothes on the sidewalk. My daughter shouted from the window, "I can't stand you anymore. You're just an expense." I canceled the mortgage check and bought a beach house for myself. I'm glad to have you. Here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. The taxi driver kept glancing at me through the rearview mirror, concern etched across his weathered face. I caught his eyes and tried to smile, but even that simple gesture felt exhausting. 3 months in the ICU had left me weak, my legs unsteady, and my grip on the walker so tight my knuckles had gone white. "You sure this is the right address, ma'am?" he asked for the second time as we pulled up to what I still thought of as home. I nodded, fumbling with my purse to pay the fare. My hands trembled as I counted out the bills, a reminder of how the stroke had changed everything about my body. The driver helped me out of the car, his arm steady under mine as I struggled to stand. That's when I saw them. My clothes were scattered across the front lawn like colorful confetti after a party nobody wanted. My favorite blue cardigan, the one Maisie had given me for Christmas 3 years ago, lay crumpled near the mailbox. The floral dress I'd worn to my grandson's birthday party was draped over the garden fence, already stained with morning dew. I stood there, leaning heavily on my walker, trying to process what I was seeing. 3 months. I'd been fighting for my life in that sterile hospital room for 3 months, and this was what I came home to. The front door flew open, and Maisie appeared in the doorway. My daughter looked exactly the same perfectly styled blonde, hair, designer jeans, that expression of perpetual irritation she'd worn since her teenage years. But seeing her now, after everything I'd been through, something felt different. Colder. "Finally," she called out, not stepping off the porch. "I was wondering when you'd show up." I opened my mouth to speak, but she wasn't finished. "I can't do this anymore, Mom." Her voice carried across the yard, loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "You're nothing but expenses now. Doctor bills, medications, and God knows what else. I have my own family to think about." The taxi driver shifted uncomfortably beside me. "Ma'am, do you want me to wait?" I should have said yes. I should have gotten back in that taxi and driven away right then. But shock had rooted me to the spot. This was my daughter, my only child. The little girl I'd raised alone after her father left us when she was 6. "Maisie," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "I just got out of the hospital." She crossed her arms, standing in the doorway of the house I'd been helping to pay for over the past 5 years. "And that's supposed to be my problem? I never asked you to have a stroke, Mom. I have 3 kids and a husband to worry about. I can't take care of you, too." The words hit me like physical blows. Each one landed in my chest, stealing what little breath I had managed to gather. The taxi driver's hand tightened on my arm, and I realized I was swaying. "Where am I supposed to go?" I asked. Maisie shrugged, the gesture so casual it made my stomach turn. "I don't know. Figure it out. You're the adult here, aren't you?" She stepped back inside and slammed the door. The sound echoed across the quiet neighborhood like a gunshot. I stood there, gripping my walker, staring at the closed door while my belongings lay scattered around me like evidence of a life that no longer mattered. The taxi driver cleared his throat gently. "Ma'am, I really think you should get back in the car." I turned to look at him, this stranger who was showing me more kindness than my own daughter. His face was soft with sympathy, and I realized he probably had children of his own. Maybe even grandchildren. I wondered if they would ever treat him the way Maisie was treating me. "Yes," I said quietly. "Yes, I think you're right." As he helped me gather what I could carry of my scattered belongings, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was something deeper, colder. A recognition that the daughter I'd sacrificed everything for didn't exist anymore. Maybe she never had. The realization should have broken me. Instead, as I settled back into the taxi seat, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. clarity. The memory of those 3 months in the ICU came flooding back as the taxi pulled away from Maisie's house. I closed my eyes and let myself remember what it had really been like, alone in that hospital bed, waiting for visitors who never came. It started on a Tuesday morning in October. I'd been making breakfast for Maisie's youngest, Emma, when the world suddenly tilted sideways. One moment I was flipping pancakes, the next I was on the kitchen floor, unable to move my left side, struggling to call for help. Maisie found me there 20 minutes later when she came downstairs. I'll never forget the look on her face, not worry, not fear, but annoyance. Pure annoyance that her morning routine had been disrupted. "Mom, what are you doing on the floor?" she'd asked, as if I'd chosen to lie there among the scattered pancakes. The ambulance ride was a blur of sirens and medical terms I didn't understand. But I remember holding on to one thought. Maisie would be there when I woke up. She would be sitting beside my bed, holding my hand, the way I'd done for her through every childhood illness, every heartbreak, every crisis. I was wrong. The first week, I kept asking the nurses if my daughter had called. "She's probably just busy," I told them, making excuses even as machines monitored my every heartbeat. "She has 3 children. It's hard to get away." Dr. Peterson, my neurologist, was a kind woman about Maisie's age. After the first 2 weeks, she stopped mentioning family support in my treatment plan. She'd seen enough to understand that I was facing this alone. "Mrs. Williams," she said one morning during rounds, "is there anyone else we can contact? A friend, perhaps? Another relative?" I shook my head, embarrassed. I'd spent so many years focused on Maisie and her family that I'd let my friendships fade. My sister lived across the country, and we barely spoke anymore. I had put all my emotional eggs in one basket, and now that basket had abandoned me. The physical therapy was the hardest part. Not because of the exercises, though those were brutal enough, but because of the constant reminders of what I'd lost. My left leg dragged slightly when I walked. My fine motor skills were compromised. Simple tasks like buttoning a shirt or writing my name took enormous concentration. "You're doing great, Laverne," my physical therapist Marcus would say. "Your determination is remarkable. Your family must be so proud." I never corrected him. How could I explain that my family consisted of one daughter who hadn't visited once, who hadn't even called to see if I was alive? The occupational therapist taught me how to use adaptive equipment, a walker, grab bars, special utensils for eating, tools that would help me live independently again. But where would I use them? I'd been living in Maisie's house for 2 years, ever since her husband Derek convinced me to sell my little apartment and move in to help with the children. Now I understood it had never been about helping. It had been about convenience, free childcare, someone to cook and clean, an extra source of income. I'd been useful. Now I was damaged goods. 3 weeks into my stay, a social worker named Janet came to see me. She was younger than Maisie, with tired eyes and a gentle manner. "Laverne, we need to discuss your discharge plans," she said, settling into the uncomfortable visitor's chair that no one had ever used for me. "Where will you be going when you're released?" I stared at her, unable to answer. I'd been asking myself the same question for weeks. Finally, I said, "I suppose I'll go back to my daughter's house." Janet nodded, making notes. "And she's prepared. To help with your care, you'll need assistance with daily activities for a while." "I'm sure she is," I lied. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. Maisie hadn't visited, hadn't called, hadn't asked about my progress. The nurses had stopped mentioning family altogether, treating me with the gentle kindness reserved for people who truly have no one. On my last night in the hospital, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of the ICU. In the morning, I would be discharged. I would go back to Maisie's house and pretend that everything was normal, that 3 months of abandonment meant nothing. But as I watched the sun rise through my hospital window, I realized something had changed in me during those long, lonely months. I'd had time to think, to remember, to see my life with startling clarity. I'd spent 67 years putting everyone else first. And where had it gotten me? Sitting in that taxi, surrounded by my scattered belongings, I couldn't stop my mind from wandering back to the beginning. To the years when I thought sacrifice meant love, when giving everything seemed like the right thing to do. Maisie was 6 when her father walked out. I can still picture her little face pressed against the living room window, waiting for him to come back from his business trip. He never did. The divorce papers came 3 weeks later, along with a note saying he'd found himself and couldn't be tied down anymore. I was 28, working part-time at a dental office, with no college degree and a mortgage I couldn't afford alone. But I looked at Maisie's trusting eyes and made a promise I'd keep my family together, no matter what. The first job was cleaning offices at night. I'd put Maisie to bed at 7, then drive across town to vacuum and empty trash cans until 3 in the morning. Mrs. Henderson next door watched her for $20 a week, money I could barely spare but had to find. The second job came when Maisie turned 8 and Mrs. Henderson moved away. I started working weekends at a grocery store, stocking shelves and running register. Maisie would come with me, doing homework in the break room, falling asleep in the back office on the old couch the manager let me bring in. "Mama, why do you have to work so much?" she asked one Sunday afternoon. Her coloring book spread across my lap as I counted register receipts. "So you can have everything you need, sweetheart," I told her, smoothing her hair. "So you can go to college and be anything you want to be." She was 14 when I sold my mother's engagement ring to pay for her first car. An old Honda with rust spots and a radio that only picked up AM stations, but Maisie loved it. She hugged me so tight that day, tears in her eyes. "I'll pay you back, Mama," she promised. "When I'm older, I'll take care of you." I believed her. God help me. I believed every word. The third job came during her senior year when she decided she wanted to go to state university instead of the community college we could afford. $40,000 a year for tuition, room, and board. I started cleaning houses during the day, my knees screaming as I scrubbed other people's bathrooms so Maisie could live in a dorm and join a sorority. I sold my parents' house that year, too. The little blue cottage where I'd grown up, filled with memories of Sunday dinners and Christmas mornings. But Maisie needed money for textbooks and a meal plan, and the equity in that house meant she wouldn't have to get a student job. "You're the best mom ever," she said when I handed her the check for her first semester. "I'm going to make you so proud." 4 years later, she graduated with a business degree and immediately got engaged to Derek, a boy from her accounting class, whose parents owned a successful construction company. They had a lavish wedding at the country club, paid for with the last of my savings, and a loan I'd be paying off for the next 5 years. The grandchildren came quickly. Emma first, then James, then little Sophie. Beautiful, perfect babies that I adored from the moment I met them. Maisie was overwhelmed, Derek worked long hours, and naturally, I stepped in to help. "Just until I get back on my feet," Maisie said when she asked me to babysit Emma 3 days a week. Derek's parents help with money, but they're not really the hands-on type. 3 days became 5. 5 became every weekday. Soon I was packing diaper bags and making bottles, doing laundry and preparing meals. When James was born 18 months later, Maisie was too exhausted to manage both children. "Could you maybe stay over a few nights?" she asked, dark circles under her eyes, "just until he starts sleeping through the night." The few nights turned into weeks, then months. When Sophie arrived 2 years later, there was no discussion. I simply moved into the spare bedroom and became the live-in grandmother. "We couldn't do this without you, Mom," Derek said one evening as I cleaned up after dinner while he and Maisie watched TV. "You're a lifesaver." But somewhere along the way, being a lifesaver became being invisible. I was expected to be available but not intrusive, helpful but not needy. The children called me Nana, but when they needed comfort, they ran to Maisie. When they achieved something special, it was Derek who got the hugs. I told myself it didn't matter. Family was about sacrifice, about putting others first. That's what mothers did. That's what grandmothers did. The taxi driver was watching me in the rearview mirror again. "You okay back there, ma'am?" I realized I'd been crying silently, tears streaming down my cheeks as I stared at Maisie's closed front door. 40 years of sacrifice, and this was my reward: a pile of wet clothes on a stranger's lawn and a daughter who couldn't be bothered to visit me in the hospital. "I'm fine," I said, wiping my eyes. Just remembering things I'd rather forget. Living in Maisie's house for 2 years before my stroke had been like watching myself disappear in slow motion. It didn't happen all at once, the transformation from beloved grandmother to unwanted burden. It was gradual, insidious, like water slowly wearing away stone. It started with small things. Comments about how I loaded the dishwasher wrong, or how I folded the children's clothes differently than Maisie preferred. Derek would roll his eyes when I asked about their day, as if my interest was an intrusion rather than genuine care. "Mom, you don't need to wait up for us," Maisie said one Friday night when they came home from dinner at 10:30. I'd been reading in the living room, keeping an ear out for the children upstairs. "We're adults. We don't need a babysitter." But the next weekend, when they wanted to go out, it was assumed I'd be there. No asking, no please, just, "We'll be back by midnight," called over their shoulders as they headed out the door. The children began to change too. Emma, who used to run to me with scraped knees and hurt feelings, started going to Maisie instead. When I offered to help with homework, James would say, "Dad already explained it to me." Sophie, the youngest, barely acknowledged me anymore unless she wanted something. "They're just getting older," Maisie explained when I mentioned feeling left out. "Kids naturally gravitate toward their parents as they grow up. It's normal." But it didn't feel normal. It felt like I was being erased from their lives, one interaction at a time. The worst part was how they talked about me when they thought I couldn't hear. Late at night, after the children were asleep, their voices would carry from the kitchen to my bedroom. "She's getting slower," Derek said one evening. "Did you see how long it took her to get Emma ready for school this morning?" "I know," Maisie replied. "And she forgot to pack James's lunch again yesterday. I had to bring it to school during my lunch break." I had packed his lunch. It was sitting on the counter where I always left it. But somehow, in Maisie's version of events, I was the one who'd forgotten. The criticisms became more frequent, more pointed. I was too lenient with the children. I was too strict. I cooked dinner too early. I cleaned the bathrooms wrong. I watched too much television. I didn't help enough around the house. Nothing I did was right anymore. "Maybe you should think about getting your own place again," Maisie suggested one morning over coffee. "Now that the kids are older, we don't really need as much help." But when I started looking at apartments, suddenly there were reasons I couldn't move. Emma's school play was coming up. James had been asking for me specifically to help with his science project. Sophie was going through a difficult phase and needed stability. "Maybe wait until after the holidays," Derek said. The kids would be devastated if Nana moved out before Christmas. So I stayed, trapped in a house where I was simultaneously essential and unwanted. Needed, but resented. The isolation was the cruelest part. My few remaining friends had gradually stopped calling. "We know you're busy with family," they'd say. When I did manage to reach them, Maisie encouraged this distance in subtle ways. "You don't want to burden Helen with your problems," she'd say, when I mentioned calling my old friend from the dental office. "She has her own life to worry about." When I mentioned visiting my sister in Oregon, Maisie's face would tighten. "Right now? With everything we have going on? I really need you here, Mom." So I stayed. I made myself smaller, quieter, more accommodating. I tried to anticipate their needs before they voiced them, tried to be useful without being noticed. The call. Morning of my stroke, I'd been up since 5:30, making pancakes for the children's breakfast and packing their lunches. Maisie had been particularly sharp the night before, complaining that I'd put too much detergent in the washing machine and ruined Derek's work shirts. "I don't know why this is so difficult for you," she'd snapped. "It's laundry, not rocket science." I'd apologized and offered to replace the shirts, but she'd just waved me away with that look of disgust I'd been seeing more and more often. When the stroke hit and I collapsed on that kitchen floor, my first thought wasn't fear for myself. It was worry about the pancakes burning on the stove and whether the children would have breakfast before school. Even as the ambulance came, even as the paramedics worked over me, I was thinking about Maisie's schedule and how this would inconvenience her. I should have known then. The annoyance in her eyes as she watched the EMTs load me onto the stretcher should have told me everything I needed to know about what the next 3 months would bring. But hope dies hard, especially the hope that your child loves you enough to forgive you for getting sick. The taxi dropped me off at a small motel on the outskirts of town. $28 a night, continental breakfast included, and a sympathetic desk clerk who didn't ask questions about why a 67-year-old woman with a walker was checking in alone with a garbage bag full of damp clothes. My room was clean but sparse, a single bed, a small table, and a chair that had seen better days. I sat on the edge of the bed, still processing what had happened. 3 months in the hospital, and Maisie had used that time to completely erase me from her life. But as the shock began to wear off, something else emerged. Anger. Pure, white-hot anger at the daughter I'd sacrificed everything for. I reached for my purse and pulled out my checkbook, intending to see how much money I had for extended motel stays. That's when I noticed something strange. The register showed a balance that was impossibly low. According to my records, I should have had nearly $8,000 in my checking account. The balance showed $412. My. Hands shook as I dialed the bank's customer service number. "Mrs. Williams," the representative said after I'd provided my account information. "I show several large withdrawals over the past 3 months, all authorized by your power of attorney." "My what?" "Your daughter, Maisie Parker, has been listed as your power of attorney since October 15th. She's made several withdrawals to cover medical expenses and care costs." The room started spinning. I gripped the phone tighter. "I never signed a power of attorney." There was a pause. "Ma'am, I have the documentation right here. It was notarized and filed while you were in the hospital for your medical care according to the notes." After I hung up, I sat in that dingy motel room and felt something crack open inside my chest. Not only had Maisie abandoned me during my illness, she'd stolen from me. She'd somehow obtained legal control of my finances and drained my account while I was fighting for my life. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She didn't know about the other accounts. My father had been a cautious man, suspicious of banks and government oversight. Before he died, he'd taught me the value of keeping money in different places. "Never put all your eggs in one basket, Laverne," he'd said. "And never let anyone know exactly how much you have." I'd followed his advice. The checking account Maisie knew about was what I used for daily expenses, but there was a savings account at a different bank, one I'd been contributing to for 40 years. Money from my parents' life insurance, the proceeds from selling their house, careful investments I'd made over the decades. Money Maisie had no idea existed. The next morning, I took a taxi to First National Bank, where I'd had an account since 1982. The balance made me gasp. Nearly $200,000, untouched and earning interest for all these years. "Mrs. Williams," the branch manager Patricia greeted me warmly. "It's been so long since we've seen you. How can we help you today?" I explained my situation carefully, watching her expression grow more concerned with each detail. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. "What you're describing sounds like financial elder abuse. she said gently. It's more common than you might think. Adult children who take advantage of their parents' trust. What can I do about it? Patricia gave me the name of an attorney who specialized in elder law. Martha Rodriguez has handled cases like this before. She's tough but fair. That afternoon, I sat in Martha Rodriguez's office, a small woman with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. I told her everything: Maisie's control over my finances, the power of attorney I'd never signed, the months of abandonment in the hospital. We can challenge the power of attorney, Martha said, making notes. If you didn't sign it willingly, or if you were incapacitated when it was filed, we have grounds to have it invalidated. But I have to ask, are you prepared for this to get ugly? Family financial disputes usually do. I thought about Maisie's face as she'd screamed at me from her doorway. About 3 months of silence while I learned to walk again. About coming home to my belongings scattered on the lawn like garbage. It's already ugly, I said. Martha smiled, and I saw something fierce in her expression. Good. Let's get your money back. But as we began to dig deeper into the paperwork, Martha discovered something that made my blood run cold. Maisie hadn't just stolen from my checking account. She'd been planning this for months. Look at this, Martha said, spreading documents across her desk. She filed paperwork to have you declared mentally incompetent. The stroke was just the opportunity she was waiting for. The papers were dated 2 weeks before my stroke. Maisie had been planning to have me declared unfit to manage my own affairs, to take control of my finances and my life. The stroke had simply made it easier. She was going to put me in a nursing home, I whispered, reading through the documents. She'd already contacted 3 facilities. Martha nodded grimly. And she would have been your legal guardian, controlling every aspect of your care and your finances. This wasn't impulse, Mrs. Williams. This was premeditated. Sitting in that lawyer's office, holding papers that proved my daughter had been planning to rob me of my freedom and my dignity, I felt the last vestiges of motherly love die in my chest. Maisie hadn't just abandoned me. She'd been actively working to destroy me. 6 weeks later, I stood on the deck of my new home, watching the morning sun paint the ocean in shades of gold and pink. The house was small, just 2 bedrooms and a single bathroom, but it was mine. Completely, legally, undeniably mine. The legal battle had been swift and decisive. Martha Rodriguez was as fierce as she'd promised, and when faced with evidence of fraudulent power of attorney documents and planned elder abuse, Maisie's lawyer had advised her to settle quickly and quietly. My stolen money was returned, along with penalties and interest. More importantly, all legal documents giving Maisie any control over my affairs were nullified. I was, in the eyes of the law, a competent adult capable of making my own decisions. The house had been a lucky find, a small beach cottage in a quiet community 40 miles from Maisie's neighborhood. The previous owner had been an elderly man whose children wanted a quick sale. I'd paid cash, no mortgage, no debt, no strings attached to anyone. I was adapting to my physical limitations better than I'd expected. The walker helped with balance, and I'd had grab bars installed in the bathroom and shower. A local grocery store delivered twice a week, and I'd found a gentle yoga class for seniors at the community center. For the first time in decades, my time was my own. I read books without interruption, watched movies I actually wanted to see, and ate meals when I was hungry, rather than when someone else's schedule demanded it. The isolation I'd feared turned out to be exactly what I needed. Peace, quiet, the absence of criticism and constant demands. It was on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after I'd moved in, that I heard the familiar sound of Maisie's car in my driveway. I'd been expecting this visit, though I'd hoped it might never come. I opened the door before she could knock. She stood on my small porch, looking smaller somehow than she had that terrible day outside her house. Her designer clothes were wrinkled, her usually perfect hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. "Mom," she said, and I heard something in her voice I hadn't heard in years. Uncertainty. Maisie. I didn't invite her in. Can we talk? Please? I considered closing the door, but curiosity won. I stepped aside, and she entered my small living room, her eyes taking in the simple furniture, the paperback book stacked on the coffee table, the view of the ocean through the sliding glass doors. "It's nice," she said, sounding surprised. "Really nice." I settled into my favorite chair, a comfortable recliner I'd bought specifically for my needs. Maisie sat on the edge of the couch, fidgeting with her purse strap. "Derek and I are getting divorced," she said suddenly. I raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "His parents found out about what I did to you, about the money." She looked up at me, and I saw tears in her eyes. They were horrified. They said they couldn't be associated with someone who would steal from their own mother. "I see. Derek's been ordered to pay alimony and child support, but it's not enough. I can't afford the house payments without your help." She paused, swallowing. Hard. "I'm going to lose everything." I studied my daughter's face, looking for some sign of genuine remorse, some acknowledgement of the pain she'd caused. What I saw instead was the same thing I'd always seen: panic at the consequences of her actions, not regret for the actions themselves. "Why are you telling me this, Maisie?" "Because I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But I'm still your daughter, and those are still your grandchildren. Doesn't that mean anything?" I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of 40 years of manipulation in those words. "What does it mean to you?" She blinked, clearly not expecting the question. "You didn't visit me once in 3 months," I continued. "You stole my money while I was fighting for my life. You threw my belongings on the lawn like garbage and told me I was nothing but expenses. What did being your mother mean then?" "I was overwhelmed," she said, tears flowing freely now. "I didn't know how to handle everything. The kids were asking questions. Derek was stressed about work, and I just panicked. So you decided to steal from me and plan to have me declared incompetent?" Her face went white. "You know about that?" "I know about all of it. The nursing home applications, the guardianship papers, everything." I kept my voice calm, steady. "This wasn't a moment of panic, Maisie. This was planned. You were going to take my freedom, my dignity, and my money, and warehouse me somewhere convenient." She buried her face in her hands, sobbing. "I didn't mean for it to go that far. I just wanted to make sure you were taken care of." "No," I said firmly. "You wanted to make sure I was contained. There's a difference." We sat in silence for several minutes, the only sound her crying and the distant crash of waves against the shore. Finally, she looked up. "What do you want from me? How can I fix this?" I considered her question carefully. "I want you to leave." "Mom?" "Please. And I want you to think about what kind of person you've become, what kind of mother you want to be to your children, because right now, you're teaching them that family members are disposable when they become inconvenient." I stood up, signaling the end of our conversation. "If you ever want a real relationship with me, one where I'm treated with respect and dignity, you know where to find me. But I won't be anyone's ATM or babysitter anymore. And I won't tolerate being treated as less than human." Maisie stood slowly, understanding that this was final. At the door, she turned back one last time. "I do love you, Mom." I looked at her. This stranger who shared my DNA but none of my values. "I hope someday you learn what love actually means." After she left, I returned to my chair and watched the ocean. The waves rolled in and out with eternal patience, wearing away the shore grain by grain, reshaping the landscape through persistence and time. I was 67 years old, walking with a walker, living alone in a small beach house. By some standards, my life had been diminished, but sitting there in the silence I'd chosen, in the home I'd bought with my own money, answerable to no one but myself, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. I felt free. Now, I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.